First question is always the toughest, so we'll skip right past that onto the second question. Who has the second question?
How do you know that the disciples of Jesus actually wrote the Bible and it's not some crazy person's book?
How do you know the disciples actually wrote the Bible and it's not some crazy person's book? Could be both.
Your English teachers have two books that they ask you to read by a guy named Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. You take the author Homer on trust. He's called the blind prophet. You take the same standards that the English teacher puts for that book and put it to the Bible. Homer did not write the Iliad and the Odyssey, because the Bible has more proof and more tests that show that the disciples did write it. Now, whether they're crazy or not, I don't know. But anyone who wrote the New Testament, they had to see Jesus or walk with Jesus, or they could only be one person away from Jesus. So Jesus would be on Mark's left side, and then it could be Mark who wrote, or I could write. But Adam could not, and neither could Jeff. So the whole New Testament is written by either people who walked with Jesus, right here, or the person who walked with the person right next to Jesus. Paul is the exception. Paul met Jesus, and then he spent 3 years with the disciples, and then he wrote. So the authors walked with Jesus. Now, whether they're nuts or not, I don't know. They're considered uneducated, okay? But they did write it, and they wrote it based on what they saw. And there's one paragraph that says, we didn't write it all down. If we wrote it all down, there's not enough books. And so does that help?
Just get a little more boring and technical. I'm sorry, I can't help myself. We have historical writings from the disciples of the disciples. So, like for instance, John had some disciples, I believe Papias, Polycarp, and then Polycarp had a disciple, I think it was Irenaeus, and you have a chain of evidence pointing back to John as the person who wrote John. And in the same way, you have these early church fathers, is what they're called. They weren't the apostles, they were disciples of the apostles and then disciples of them. But you can see in their writings, they are saying the disciples really wrote this stuff. And so if you're going to doubt the disciples, you also have to doubt their disciples and their disciples and their disciples. There's this tradition from people, a chain of evidence, right? Like the way a crime investigation would have, custody of evidence of who had it and when. You can see this chain of evidence going back from, pointing back to the disciples. So.
I think your question is not as technical as, let me thought, how do we know is what your question's. We don't. It's faith. Let me ask you this. What are you breathing right now? How do you know? You have faith that you're breathing oxygen, correct? Okay. So here's what we believe is we believe that this book was written by 40 plus different authors that were all following the path of God, and that this is God's book that he had complete say-so in, and that it's without fallacy from beginning to the end. Okay? I never met Paul. I never met David. I never met any of these guys, and I didn't see any of them write it. So I don't know. I just have faith. And it's the same thing that you have faith that what you're breathing is oxygen. You don't know that that's what you're breathing, but you're breathing and you're staying alive, right? This is something that helps me stay alive. It helps me guide my path, and that's how I know that God actually wrote it. Does that make sense? Okay.
All right, so I'll throw one more thing on it. So, like the guys were saying, the Bible was constructed. The letters, the books, the chapters that we read were written over a period of about 1,500 years that covered about 4,000 years of human history. Okay? 42, 6, I can't remember exactly, authors. Over 1,500 years from different countries, wrote 66 books without one contradiction. That would be like you writing a story of what you've learned in school about 9/11. Okay? And then a kid in China writing a story about what they've learned about the facts and episode of 9/11. And then a kid in Australia writing their version of what they've learned and what they think and what they know about 9/11. And they all match. That's kind of crazy. And so then we read it, right? And so the Bible tells us things about our faith. And we choose to believe or not. And we have experiences. And our experiences prove what we think we believe. Does that make sense? So I can look at the facts and say, man, this is a crazy book. 1,500 years. It took 1,500 years to write all this stuff by 40-something different authors from different countries to write 66 books without one contradiction. They all tell the same story. And then when I walk it, when I read it and I try to live it, it really happens. And that's double proof. And that's better than any court. So.